Hello and welcome back to the Tudors Dynasty podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I am joined by Aurora Dawson-Hunte. Welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So I met you this weekend at the
Yes.
Wolf Hall weekend here at Cadet House, and I wanted to speak with you because you play Elizabeth Seymour in the play.
I did.
And your background, you do have background in history, and I think one of the first questions that we asked you on the drive here was how much you know about the Tudors.
Yeah.
And why don't you let the listeners know a little bit about your love for the Tudors and where that took you?
So it's not so much a background in history, it's more kind of literature. But I, as a very strange and curious 12-year-old, discovered my mum's Philippa Gregory books, which is my gateway into a bit of a Tudor addiction. And I completely devoured the books. I read them several times as a teenager. They're quite juicy, so it was also for that reason.
Do you have a favorite? Do you remember?
Probably. Okay, so there were two. The other Belinga, which is really popular, and I can't remember the name of the other one, but it was all about Elizabeth and Dudley and the sort of romance between them,
yes,
which I found very saucy. So that was that, and then I ended up at Cardinal College, which is now known as Christ Church, Oxford. So there was the link to Cardinal, and obviously that linked in really well with Wolf Hall. And then I came across the Wolf Hall trilogy and became completely addicted. But I think throughout my teenage years, I'd really been fascinated, as everyone is, with the politics and drama of the Tudors and how much I think the English imagination and English self-ideology is impacted by that period, and how much, and I say England specifically, defines itself by that particular kind of line of monarchs who came along, kind of tipped off with Elizabeth I. And they had a huge impact culturally on English history, in terms of, I think, how English people imagine themselves. And then when I came across Wolf Hall, it was something that I'd never seen the Tudors in that lens before. And I really loved it. So of course, when I got the opportunity to do the Mirror and the Light on stage, I was like, I really hope I get this job. And yeah, it's been interesting. I feel like that's even kind of taken me on a different path of understanding more about Tudor England.
Yeah. What did you think about Elizabeth Seymour?
You know what? It's so funny because I would say that up until the Hearing My Tales trilogy, I didn't really think much of her. I didn't really know that much about, I would say, not the protagonists of that kind of big drama that happened over the Tudor period. So, like with the other Belinga, like Mary Boleyn, and I knew about her, but I didn't know anything about Elizabeth Seymour. It was always Jane Seymour, and the way that she's sort of canonized in that time period as the fourth fairy, as the woman who gave him a son. So I didn't know much, and it wasn't until I came across the books that I began to understand more about her. And I think she did her job essentially of the time, which was to be a woman who married well for her family. She produced heirs, and she married again to secure the family. Marrying Cromwell's son, and Cromwell's basically an upstart, as everyone thought at the time in many ways. But she marries his son. He's gone through, quote unquote, the right education, and secures her family's position. I think, I found her to be, in Hilary's view of her, incredibly witty within the confines of what she's able to do, to be, I don't want to say well behaved, because I don't think it's it. I do think of it as doing your job. But she's incredibly witty and quite wry, whilst also managing to hold herself with great grace and decorum, which I think was something that the Seymour women did quite well, actually.
I think so too.
Yeah.
and that when you did the scene yesterday with Ben Miles, I loved seeing Elizabeth Seymour in that aspect and having that type of personality. And it made me look at her in a different way, because I've studied Thomas Seymour for many years. And people always talk about how charismatic he was. And when you portrayed Elizabeth yesterday, I saw some of that. And I thought, that's possible. It is possible that she was a lot like her brother, that she had this charisma and personality and sense of humor. That scene that you did made me laugh because
Yeah.
I love that. I have seen the letter, I think it is, that she writes to Cromwell,
Yeah.
where it is a little bit confusing whether she is interested in Cromwell himself or his son. So to
Yeah.
see that play out on stage is kind of nice. And it makes me think it could have been either way.
I think absolutely it could have been either way. I think she was open to it being either way. I mean, the position she was in when you find her, when we get to that scene, is she's a widow with children and she needs to look after her kids.
Yeah.
And the Cromwells are a pretty good option. Cromwell's very successful, he's very rich, he's very close to power. And I think she kind of is hedging her bets. I think no one's really sure. I probably there's every possibility that Cromwell was also kind of. I mean, maybe.
Right.
He considered. So I think that you had to. It's politics, right? And you have to kind of negotiate in a very careful way. So I think there was always a part of her that was open to either option because actually they're both pretty good options.
Right.
And Gregory's actually younger than her. So actually in the day, Cromwell probably would have been the better option. He was married to a widow before.
Right.
He might be open to it. It would be a really big step up for him in terms of a marriage. And I think what Hilary was able to capture really well is a sort of strange misunderstandings that may happen in an interaction between two people who are essentially negotiating a marriage.
Yeah.
And her thinking, okay, it must be you now.
Right.
And him going, oh, no. And her having to say, okay, well, in that case, nothing will happen here.
Yes.
Because I am an honourable woman.
Yes.
So I just want to make it clear. I'll marry whichever Cromwell is going to marry me.
Right.
But that's one I'm going to have to stick with.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think definitely in rehearsals, we always we're looking at him being quite taken with the charm of it and the kind of wit and how she's able to navigate that situation. And then probably having a fairly good relationship as father-in-law and daughter-in-law.
Right.
And she, does everything right for the Cromwell family because she produces an heir. And so
that's all they needed. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Either way, a marriage between the Cromwells and the Seymours was a good choice for both parties. I mean, for the Seymours being married to the Cromwell family, they didn't know what was going to happen in the end.
No.
That was a great family to be. Your nephew is going to be King of England, and then say your sister is going to be married to the man who sits closest to the king.
Yeah.
How could you go wrong there?
Yeah. And a good marriage for her because I think widows didn't have loads of options.
No.
So it was a way for her to be taken care of, for her, generations in. And it made great sense for the Cromwells because it married them into the aristocracy.
It did.
Which is something that everyone was going, you can't do this, you can't do this.
Yeah. If there is one part of the play that you enjoyed the most, was it that part or was there another?
I think I did. I loved that part because it was great fun. The audience was always really receptive to it as a scene. It says there's only a tiny bit, but it's very funny.
Yes.
And it comes after a bit of an onslaught of horrible times for Cromwell. So it's always a bit of comic relief where they go, okay, this is really funny.
We needed that.
But I really loved in the staging of the play the way that Jane's funeral was handled. It was very beautiful. There was singing and there were candles, and it wasn't labouring the point in any way. And there was a really, really beautiful scene that comes after where they're holding, Edward, and it's very moving.
Yeah.
Because so much death in the trilogy is political and no one's allowed to mourn because actually this person, they're a traitor, and so it was a moment where death was given space for a bit of grieving and a reminder that it wasn't all beheaded traitor. Everyone's frightened that they're actually going to get burned instead, or it was just a moment of real humanity. And I think especially because, as I spoke about, Cromwell's so haunted by grief himself, it gave space for there to be a little bit of grief in the play. because grief is sort of underlying the whole thing.
Really is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Aurora, I wish we had more time to speak today. This might be the first time some of my followers have heard of you.
Yeah.
If they would like to learn more about you and maybe what you're up to, how can they do that?
Oh my goodness, I don't know. Google my name. Yeah, I guess, just look online, and I've got little bits of telly mostly out there somewhere on the internet.
I'll include some links.
Thanks.
To help direct.
Yeah. Hopefully watch this space, and there'll be more exciting things. I do write as well, so
Wonderful.
There's some writing stuff in the pipeline.
Yes. Yeah, we didn't even touch base on that. We'll have to touch base again in the future. And
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. If you love the show and would like to show your support, please head on over to my Patreon page. That's Patreon, patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty for more information. Over there, you're going to find commercial-free episodes. You'll get early access, and there's some exclusive content as well, with more stuff to come as I'm rebuilding it. Also, recently I returned from England and cannot wait to go back. But this time I would love to bring you with me. So if you're interested to go on a tour of England with me, why don't you send me an email, Rebecca@tudorsdynasty.com, for more information. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.